Hey, Earth scientists, we're going to take a look at this tide chart. So hopefully this will help you to have a little bit better of an understanding of how to read a tide chart. So this is the nc.us Harbor's website, and this is looking at the tides, a tide chart for Wilmington. And the September 2018 is the date that I have pulled up. And here's your coordinates. And right here on this particular website, you can go backward in time, and then you can go forward in time over here. So since those have already been recorded, then we have access to that information. So this is just the one that I'm looking at to show you an example of how to read this. So we have this broken down by the month of September, which is what it tells you here on the title. So it has day by day, and this particular tide chart has the high tides, and then it has the low tides over here. And different tidal charts are represented a little bit differently, so that's just what this one is showing you. And then it tells you when the sun is rising and setting. And then over here you have the moon. So the moon phase is important, especially if you're like someone who goes fishing and relies on being able to read the tidal chart and knowing when you're going to be able to catch the most fish or have the longest time to fish and that kind of thing. So this is showing you the moon phases. So when we have the darkened circles here, we've got our new moon, and then the lighter circles are full moon. So that should help you a little bit with the alignment of the moon, sun, and earth to determine if you have neap tides or if you have spring tides. So when you have new moon or full moon, then you're going to have spring tide, because all of those three objects, the sun, moon, and earth, are going to be lined up. So when you have these black circles here, and when you have the white circles here, that's going to be when you're having your spring tide. So you've got the biggest difference between the low tide and the high tide, and you should be able to see that here by looking at the data. And one more thing before we look at these numbers, the tidal charts are using an average of the low tide, so it's your chart datum, and that datum point is basically just the average of the low tide for that area. And so that basically these numbers are either above the chart datum or below. So that's why it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at what the high tide or the low tide is. So for example, if we scoot on down here to the 8th of September, if we look at the low tide at 3:31 a.m., it was minus 0.0, so that's right at your average, your chart datum. And then a little bit later in the day at 9 a.m., the high tide is 4.8 feet, so it's almost 5 feet difference from the low tide to the high tide. And if we again look at the low tide in the afternoon, it's minus 0.3, so that's less than what the average is. So it's below average. And then later in the evening at 9:30, it's 5.3 for the high tide. So that's a pretty big difference from the low tide to the high tide, which you would expect, because at the full moon and the new moon is when you're going to have your spring tides. So let's look at first quarter or third quarter, and you should be able to see the neap tides pretty clearly here, how there's not that big, or not as big of a difference. So if we look at, like say on the 3rd, for example, in order to determine the difference in the tide, to confirm that this is neap tide, if you will just do a little bit of math. So at 3:22 a.m. is 4.2 for the high tide, and then the low tide at 10:16, so several hours later, was 0.3. So 4.2 minus 0.3, so that should be something like 3.9. So that's less of a difference than if we do like on the 11th, 5.1 minus 0.3, so like 5.4 difference. So it's going down to the chart datum, the average low, and then even lower than that. So you do see not a huge drastic difference in the neap tide versus the spring tide, but there is several feet difference. So there's more of a difference between the low tide and the high tide for our spring tide areas, for our new moon and full moon, versus the neap tide. The neap tide, since you've got the moon and the sun pulling in different directions, at your third quarter and first quarter, you're going to have a closer tide when you compare low tide versus high tide.